Crystal, and welcome to my kitchen. Right now, because of the coronavirus, my husband and I are both working from home, and I'm doing a lot more cooking than I normally do, as I'm sure most of you are as well. So I thought I would show you how to make my sourdough pizza crust. We live in Collingswood, New Jersey, but I'm originally from California, and if you've ever been to California, you know how much everybody out there loves sourdough. It's one of the things I miss most about living in California. The constant availability of sourdough bread, sourdough pancakes, sourdough pizza crust. My mom used to make it all the time when I was a kid. So about 10 years ago, my mom gave me some of her sourdough starter, and she'd had it probably 20, 25 years. So this is a very old sourdough starter that I use here at home. I brought it home with me in a little canning jar in my checked luggage, and thankfully it survived, it didn't suffocate, and I've been using it ever since. Having sourdough starter in your kitchen is kind of like having a science experiment all the time. And those of you that have sourdough starter and work with it regularly, you already know that. And if you don't have sourdough starter, I would encourage you to give it a try, because you can rest assured that you probably won't kill it. And if you do, you can probably bring it back to life, as I've had to do a few times over the years with my starter. So let me tell you a little bit about my recipe. First of all, this is for a very thin crust pizza, which that's my favorite, and my husband loves it also. And I stumbled upon how to make the crust really thin by accident. So I've had my recipe now for many years. I've tweaked it many times over the years. And one of the things I found a few years ago was I thought I made a mistake with my dough, and I thought I let it rest for too long. And when I went to roll out the dough, that's when I almost had a bit of a panic attack, thinking that I had messed up the whole batch, because I couldn't really roll it out with a rolling pin. But I forged ahead, not wanting to start over again, and that turned out to be the best batch of pizza crust I'd ever made with my sourdough. And now that's how I make it every single time. So there's a couple of key variables when you're working with sourdough and you're making this pizza crust. The first variable is how active is the starter that you're using, and the second is how long do you let the dough rest before you roll it out for your pizzas. So we'll talk about both of those in these videos. And this is going to be a two-step video series that I will release here on my new cooking channel. And that's because we have to have a time lapse where we allow the initial batch of the recipe to activate some of the dry yeast that I add. And then we have to wait about 24 hours for the dough to rest before we roll it out. So it's not hard, it just takes a little time and a lot of patience. So I encourage you to have something else to do in the middle, in between, so that you don't get impatient. And if you think you haven't let it rest enough, let it rest some more and you'll be fine. So let me tell you a little bit about my recipe. Well, first of all, I keep it on this little tiny Post-it note. But for all of you at home, I have written it out with very clear instructions that can accompany my video series here to hopefully make it a little easier for you. But let me tell you about what's in the recipe so you know what you'll need. First, you need 4 cups of unbleached flour. With my sourdough, and when I make my sourdough pizza crust, I always use King Arthur brand bread flour. It comes in a blue and white packaging, and it's an unbleached flour. It's okay if you don't use King Arthur. You can use any type of flour. You just need to make sure that it's unbleached. Secondly, you'll need a little bit of dry active yeast. I get the Fleischmann's dry active yeast, and you're only going to need about a half a teaspoon, so 1 packet is fine, but I think they sell it in those packets of 3, or if you have it in a container, that's fine too. Then you're going to need a cup of water, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. And then if you decide that you want to add any herbs to your dough, which sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. My husband prefers it without any herbs because he really likes to just taste the flavor of the sourdough. But my favorite is to add fresh chopped rosemary from the garden. You can also add fresh chopped thyme. I encourage you to experiment with whatever flavor of herb you enjoy, because it blends very nicely with the sourdough. My favorite happens to be rosemary, but use your own or none to your liking. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I encourage you, if you have any questions or comments or feedback, or if you're working with the recipe and you get stuck, please leave me a comment or send me an email, and I'll be happy to get back to you and help you with your sourdough pizza crust. Let's get started. I wanted to show you how active my starter is. See how there's all those bubbles? And as I stir it, see how it runs right off of my spoon. And it's not thick. I can stir it and it easily stirs, it easily moves, and most importantly, you can see all the bubbles. This is indicative that the starter is very active and it's ready to be used. I've had my starter outside of the fridge for about 2 weeks, and I've been feeding it every day. For the first week, once a day, and for the last week, about twice a day. And that's how you activate your starter after it's gone a bit dormant from being in the fridge. So welcome back. Now we're gonna mix up our sourdough for the pizza crust. So we're gonna start with 1.5 cups of the active sourdough starter. And honestly, I don't measure this part with a measuring cup. I use a soup ladle, just a normal soup ladle. And I do 3 heaping spoonfuls of the starter using this. So we'll go ahead and do that now. And when you're mixing this up, you want to use a stainless steel bowl, a glass bowl, or a ceramic bowl. You don't want to mix this up in a plastic bowl. As a matter of fact, you never want to keep your sourdough starter in a plastic bowl at all. You always want to keep it in a ceramic jar, or a glass jar. I use an old-fashioned cookie jar that I got from my neighbor's yard sale many, many years ago, and it works perfectly. And it has a wide mouth, which makes it easy to get my ladle in, as well as to feed it and stir it. Okay, so I've got my 3 heaping ladlefuls of it. Okay. And then to that, I'm gonna add my 1/2 teaspoon of dry active yeast. And some people don't use this. Some people just use the sourdough starter. I'm not a very good baker. I love to cook, and I'm a very experimental cook, but baking is not my forte. So I know that if I use a little bit of this dry active yeast, my sourdough pizza crust comes out perfectly every time. So it's a little bit of insurance for me. But I encourage you to try doing it without the yeast if that's what you want to do. Or maybe you're a more experienced baker than I am. Then I add 2 teaspoons of salt, 1 cup of tepid water, let's go ahead and put those in the sink, and then 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. Then I'm just going to give it a little bit of a stir to mix it up. And we're going to let this rest for about 1/2 hour. This will allow the dry active yeast to activate. Meanwhile, I already pre-measured out the flour I'm going to use for the next step. And I like to measure that out in advance so that I don't use too much flour. If you have a scale, it's probably better to use a scale, but I don't have a scale, so I just measure out my 4 cups. And I won't be able to put all 4 cups of flour into the dough. I'll probably be able to put around 3 to 3.5 cups of flour into the dough when I get to that step. And that's fine. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. But while we let this rest, don't forget to feed your starter because you've just taken quite a bit out of it, right? And so the way we do that is I do about 1/2 cup each time. And again, this is my unbleached flour. Don't use bleached flour. Make sure you use unbleached flour. So I use 1/2 cup of that right into my jar. This is the cookie jar I was telling you about One time it chipped, but I still use it. Then you want tepid water. And it's equal parts flour to equal parts water. I use a half a cup because I don't want to end up with such a large quantity of starter that it bubbles out and bubbles over. And then you just stir that up with a metal spoon. And there you go. Now my sourdough starter has been replenished. And I would say once you feed your starter, if you're not going to use it again for a little while, it's probably best not to put it back in the fridge right away. Let it sit out for a little bit so that it can eat the food that you just fed it to keep it alive, and maybe wait about 12 hours or so before you put it back in the fridge. That's generally how I do it, and it works really well every time. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this out because, like I said before, I'm doing a lot more cooking, and there might be some other things I want to make, or maybe I'll make another batch of pizza crust. So let's talk for a minute about that one key variable I mentioned about the starter. If the starter is really active and it's more like a runny consistency, you'll probably need a little bit more than 4 cups of flour. Versus if it's less runny and it's a little bit more thick, like maybe you didn't take it out for as many days as I did, or maybe you didn't feed it as much or as frequently as I did, so then you might need a little bit less flour. So although my recipe calls for 4 cups of flour, you may end up using a little bit more or a little bit less depending on how active your starter is when you make your recipe. And we can talk in another video about how to maintain your sourdough starter and how to keep it alive in another video. And so for now, that's it. We're gonna let this rest, like I said, for about a half an hour, and then we'll come back and we will put it on the mixing stand, add the flour, and shape the dough. And one last thing I forgot is that now would also be the time to add the herbs if you wanted to add herbs to your sourdough. This batch is going to be without any herbs, so I'm not going to add anything at this time. Thank you, and I'll see you in a little bit. So here's my sourdough pizza crust, the start of it. I've had it sitting here for about a half an hour or so. You can see it's bubbly, it's pretty thin, and that's just exactly how we want it. So it's ready for me to put this on the mixing stand and add the flour, and then we'll let it rest again.